Hello everyone and welcome on the Black Shadow, keeping well, and welcome to my personal tier listing for all 14 leaders for Dune Imperium with the Immortality and Rise of Ix expansions. This has come out a little bit on a semi-whim. Last night myself and CJ and a few others were up testing some of the homebrew leaders being made for the game. This was courtesy of our patrons who voted on it and asked us to do so. A huge thanks to them for that, definitely. And we'll be getting a podcast together with our thoughts on that fairly soon. We just got to get a few more games in so far. But I realised after that and waking up the next day that I've never actually done a leader tier listing for this game, which is kind of surprising. We have had one before on Hidden Assets of the Rise of Ix expansion, but that was CJ and Patience of Virtue. I wasn't involved in that one at all. And I just figured, well, as I'm sort of getting into this mindset of kind of critiquing leaders and thinking what works, what doesn't, and what's good and what's bad, why not have a sit down? I've got not much else to do this evening, so I figured, what the heck, let's sit down and rank all 40 leaders and see what we make them. I've just booted up tier maker list here. I've not added or changed anything here. We might add some extra tiers. I don't know. We'll see how we go. The plan is I want to kind of rank them on a sort of general basis. I think we're in an interesting spot with Immortality specifically, where two things I think have happened over the course of time since the Rise of Ix. I do think overall the general banding of these has gotten a lot tighter since the Rise of Ix. With Rise of Ix, you typically thought of those like kind of like 4 or 6 leaders that you pick. You know, Baron Harkonnen, Tessia Vernius, Beast Raban, and then probably something like a Leto's always pretty solid. 100 can be decent. There's a couple of leaders that also definitely get there as well. But outside of that, you're already starting to tread kind of on more shaky waters, and you're kind of incentivized to stick to those main sort of core leaders that either do a lot of shipping or just hit tons of faction tracks. Immortality has changed that a lot. Card draw in general value has improved because the value of the Imperium row has also just improved in general. So just drawing more cards, being able to graph stuff like that has become really, really powerful of action compression and such. So I want to kind of take a more of a broad view, not just look at like, okay, like this leader can hire on be the best leader in the game, thus they are the best leader in the game. I want to try and look at, you know, different leaders at different positions, different situations. I don't want to go too far into the weeds on this though. I think that's something you can definitely get into. But a general cursory examination of the leads where I think they're at now. And, well, yeah, we'll just kind of see how we go here. A little bit freeform, but I think it should be interesting. Also, we're going to have ourselves our interactive board here as well, so we can obviously look at our various leaders, as well as kind of exploring decks and bits and pieces and what kind of works them well. And even if you just use as a general takeaway of some, you know, extra bits and tips for certain leaders, you know, if you're kind of using, you know, like a pool of Atreides or whatever else, and you're kind of like not too sure how best to use them, maybe we can give you some tips and tricks on the way of things to kind of look out for. This is not going to be the most scientific ratings I've ever done, and nor do I think I'm like experts of any of these particular. But I like to think I've played enough games. I've kind of seen what tends to and to not work, and you know, I like to think there's some experience that I can at least impart to some of you guys. So we'll touch upon it as we go. Then let's get started. Okay, then. So first up for us is going to be Armand Ecaz. So Armand Ecaz is not a leader that I ever used a ton in Rise of X where he came out for. We didn't have any extra leaders in Immortality. I think Armand Ecaz was a little niche, maybe, in Rise of Ix. I think he definitely has his strengths, but it was very much suited to just simply kind of very heavy deck building and mainly Spice Must Flow deck building, you know, and just kind of getting the engine going, picking up your full influence points, picking up a combat point somewhere, and then just buying Spice Must Flows and rocking and rolling from there, basically. And if you can get any other side points in that, great. I do think that while it was kind of a bit niche, though potentially very, very effective, I think his general abilities have become a lot more broad now in the application. I don't think you have to go down that route at all. I think as Ecaz, you could probably be looking to buy a Spice or two as you go, but I think his power of being able to kind of obviously make use of unload effects with his coordination ability, we'll talk about it a bit more in a moment, is definitely very, very strong. And I think Ecaz can definitely get a ton of value out of graph cards as well, you know, by taking, you know, sort of cheap 2-3 cost cards, you know, with decent-ish agent effects, and then pairing them with other graph cards. Very, very strong with the Talaxu row, and very, very dangerous indeed. So let's talk his abilities. First up, we got Coordination, being able to trash a card in play if you send 2 agents to non-faction spaces. This is definitely improved since Rise of Ix, and that is purely because of experimentation. Experimentation, being able to send agents, to these various spy spaces. In Rise of Ix wasn't great with Dune Desert Planet, just not a particularly amazing card. But now that you've got hold of the entire Talaxu track, and how it works here, and just getting the research on the side has greatly increased the value of those spaces. So whereas Ecaz previously might kind of want to try to stick to faction spaces very early on, now you can definitely consider just, if you have to hit like Imperial Base or even Hager Basin early, it's not a bad thing. Being able to kind of trash those, the recons and your daggers out of your deck fairly early. Picking obviously some extra Imperial Roast cards, definitely very, very strong. So coordination is always good. I do honestly forget to use them every now and again. I do have a habit of like playing it and just forgetting, like, oh yeah, I can trash, because I don't admittedly play Ecaz a ton. But Ecaz is very, very solid now. And this also, of course, pairs into his conscription ability, being able to pick up cards that cost 3 persuasion or less. As for Ecaz's conscription ring ability, it's always been pretty good. Being able to just straight acquire a card that costs 3 persuasion or less is very, very good. Don't get me wrong about that, and it's great, obviously, for lots of sniping. I do think its value has changed a little bit in Rise of Ix, though. There are, in Immortality, I should say, there are lots of good Rise of Ix cards. There's absolutely buckets of cards that you can literally just get hold of, either early game, any super happy, pretty much anything with unload effect as well. Being able to reveal and trash it in the same spot is obviously really, really strong. Cards like Shifting Legions as well, of course, really, really good for their value. And even if you don't really use them, it's still a 2 persuasion card. Super good. Other players can't get them. That's all well and fine. But I do also think there are other kind of options available to you now. And there are some interesting cards that you can get hold of in Immortality. We'll talk about a few of them. I think probably the best of the lot might well be Dissecting Kit. It's a graph card, which is great for Ecaz. It's what you want. It can allow him to trash further with other cards if he doesn't want to. The access is good for him, getting a council, or even maybe some tech negotiation or tech, or actual, Dreadnoughts tech's all really, really good. I do think Dissecting Kit's probably its biggest strength is being able to reveal for a Talaxu Beetle in the mid-game, and that is really, really good, especially as Ecaz. If you're already hitting a lot of spy spots in order to kind of get coordination going, you're going to be proceeding along the research track here faster than you might expect, and as such, Dissecting's reveal is probably going to get enabled a lot faster than you would expect. So very, very strong, Matt, and I reckon possibly the best card from Get Immortality. There's some other good candidates, though. Talaxu Surgeon is probably the only other one. And the reason for that is because Talaxu Surgeon is absurdly strong. Being able to turn specimens into beetles, again, plays into Ecaz as well. You're perhaps doing more research so you can get those specimens here. You follow that specimen track here, cash them in for beetles, and you're happy days. Super, super powerful. Free cost somehow. I don't know how. Very, very powerful. But there's some other decent cards that have turned Immortality as well. Plan Couplings, very, very solid. Again, another graph card, always good. Just allowing to kind of get the action compression in with other, experimentations mid-game. When you're then not hitting the spy spots so much, you've got your Swordmaster. You want to start hitting some faction spaces more? Well, just Plan Coupling to just secrets. Great, can't hate that at all. Pretty decent value. I do actually think Spiritual Fervor is an interesting one as well. It can be very, very tricky to pick up that and get the acquire bonus of the research. You can kind of snipe some extra rewards. Very dangerous for sort of like getting hold of influence bombs out of nowhere, which people aren't expecting. So that can be a little bit tricky. And obviously just generally getting progress. Obviously some of these later game rewards, obviously also pretty nice. So I think Spiritual is one that I wouldn't go heavy on. But, I think it should be considered. And the last one I'm going to point out here as well, which is an interesting one, Show of Strength, also a good shout here. If you can get this again compared with, like, some grafting, or if you're using this with, like, some extra troops and going combat heavy, obviously getting the card draw very, very good. And it's also not a bad reveal for Persuasion 2 Swords. Pretty decent. So how does Ecaz fare with positioning around the table? I think he fares fine. I don't think there's any particular standout spots for Ecaz that no one else kind of already has. There's some interesting things going on, though, however, for him. Obviously, his conscription, if you're concerned that there's a Helena in the game and there's some juicy cards, you're after, like, Talaxu Surgeon, Shifting, or whatever else, and you're concerned there's a Helena, obviously, picking him early is not the worst. Being able, if you've got him, like, in first position here, just sending his Signet Ring to smuggling is great. You're getting the value, you're denying Swordmaster probably further down the table, and it's obviously part of getting hold of your conscription, pick up some good cards. Obviously, decent value. You know, and that also can apply sort of further back in the line. If there is no Helena in the game specifically, you know, you can kind of sit in third or fourth position, knowing that you're going to be able to conscript some cards on the row and pinch them, and that players aren't going to be able to play for those. They're not going to be hard revealing for like a Talaxu Surgeon. Very, very unlikely. So you don't have to worry about that too much. Well, I do think he has in this weird spot where, while I don't think there's any really bad places, I would say, to pick Ecaz, I don't think there's any great positions for him either. He can't really go into second position. It's not great for him. You'd rather pick a lot of other leaders, either that can, you know, go double smuggling for Swordmaster more reliably, or can, like, threaten getting hold of fold space, or obviously want to hit faction access. If you're, like, early in the listing here, like, if you're in second position, you're typically hitting a faction space, which is not really what Ecaz wants to do. Ecaz in third, I think, is actually not that bad, because you would assume, say, with smuggling fold space gone, Ecaz is a good candidate for going wealth mentat, and then looking to hit maybe like a city, or maybe like Hagar Basin or something, or Imperial Basin if it's still sitting there. Maybe even tech negotiation, perhaps, and looking to get that coordination ability off as well. Maybe picking up some conflicts as well, potentially. He has some flexibility there, but I think it's a little tricky for him, and I don't think he's that amazing in the fourth either at the moment. You know, it's not ideal. If there's a Helena in the game, I think it's almost impossible, I think, to pick Ecaz reliably if you're going after certain cards in the road, because if Helena gets picked in third, you're just kind of dead to rights a little bit, and I think that is a real problem for him. But I think once you get past the opening round or two, and you get Ecaz going, and once he gets coordination underway, and you start getting that deck building, I think it's much less of an issue. Ecaz, I also think, not again, I would probably say Ecaz's best position, I think, is third on the table. Just because you're not feeling so restricted, as I've talked about in a recent video I did about kind of the first, second player dance kind of going on with the whole Swordmaster and instead of shipping thing. Ecaz can definitely excel from being able to go, you know, Wealth Mentat early, or maybe even going, you know, Steel Suits Research, making a plug for some decent rogue cards like Pirate of Rees, Stitch Horror for Armand Ecaz is absolutely insane. It is for a lot of players, but Ecaz as well, very, very, very dangerous. So I'd say probably third place is his best pick, because then you're not too worried who's in fourth spot. Just be careful of like an Ilban or something coming in second place, or Leto in second place. You definitely don't want to be losing that Menta access in the mid game. Sort of rounds 3, 4. If you're struggling to get hold of your Swordmaster and you kind of have to wait for it a bit, Menta might be a way around that. So just be a little bit careful of that. As to where I put Ecaz on the tier listing, I think it's probably got to be, probably a B. I would imagine. I think a strong B. I think a pretty decent B. Kind of verging on the A rank, but I don't think quite making it. I do think Ecaz does struggle a little bit in some positions and can get a little bit overwhelmed by some of the leaders in this game, which is definitely a problem. And as I do think his early game can be kind of slow. Ecaz is all about kind of building up, and which is interesting because in a way this game's a little bit more like that anyways. It's, as I say, it's more of an arms race now than it was in the Rise of Ix. But I just don't think he's got any particular areas that really excel in. And I do think kind of like having to spend a little bit of time getting coordination going sometimes means you might be forced to kind of visit space you don't want to necessarily. Your experimentations can help with that potentially, but I just think Ecaz is a little reliant on either getting hold of his Swordmaster or getting those Mentats early, and there's a lot more competition for those now because card draw leaders are probably more popular as they're just generally more powerful, so you're not going to get as much free reign of Mentats perhaps you used to. But I still think Ecaz is very solid. I don't think you can go particularly wrong with him in general. You just got to remember that you've got to tailor your strategy of playing just a little bit. Make sure you're hitting those board spots to get coordination off. Big part of him. Conspire is great, but I think coordination is the real meat of Armand Ecaz in this game, and using that to kind of get rid of those cheap cards and just powering your deck superly. And if you can get a graph card or two on the side, then you're off to the races. But I don't think I can give Ecaz into the A's. It's close, but I don't think he's consistent enough at the moment with Immortality, or popular enough, I think, generally in choices to really justify that. I think a good B is probably about right for him. So next up, we've got Countess Ariana, who is probably one of the least played leaders in general in Dune Imperium, and I would also suggest, and being brutally honest, as far as my general experience with Dune Imperium as a whole, is probably my least played leader in the entire game. I've almost never used her. I think in base game, she was kind of funky, and I don't think particularly effective. And I think Rise of Ix, it was pretty tricky a lot of the time to really use Ariana. You had to use it in very specific circumstances, i.e. you're basically first to act, and Sayadine is there, and you just insta-reveal for it, and you just hope that you'll all kind of works out, and people don't bother trying to block you. Ariana has changed a heck of a lot with immortality in how her uses and how to apply her abilities. And kind of, I think, her general direction of what you're trying to do in the game has also changed a lot of Ariana with immortality as well. We'll go for abilities first. They're the simplest parts here. Spice Addict, being able to draw a card and sacrificing spice when you gain spice. And you go harvesting, is definitely probably better now. Again, simply because experimentation exists and being able to use the ability to draw cards, cycle through your deck, buy a higher persuasion cards, try and go down Spice's Flows maybe, and obviously looking to progress down the Talaxu track obviously is pretty straightforward. I still also think that Ariana probably is one of the best rings in the game, being able to just generate water, and water is probably more valuable now than it ever used to be with immortality, with lots of spice harvesting, obviously you need to have water in order to use your experimentations, and also just research station in general. Its value, I think, has gone up since Rise of Ix, being the fact that it has the experimentation. It's definitely better and stronger than the extra card draw, being able to get those extra rewards on the Talaxu track. So, on the face of it, you would say that Ariana has probably improved. I think that might be a bit of a low bar, but I feel like she's got definitely a lot more playability now. But I think there is one particular crutch to her general game plan in particular now. And I believe that fairly understandably revolves around the Talaxu row. You gotta look at leaders, what their abilities do, and typically as you're kind of assessing what advantages that leader gives, you're kind of looking at what allows a certain leader to do something before anyone else realistically can. And because you've got that extra water, it means that Ariana is able to research more specifically, again, via the research station, and as such, she can be very, very good for targeting specific Talaxu row cards. I pulled out 6 in particular here, which, for varying reasons and different realities here. But I think all of these are ones that Ariana can very, very capably aim for. She's not required to go still suits to research station, which is a limitation sometimes. Being able to get that extra option with the signet ring is obviously pretty good. I see my camera's in the way. I do apologize. So that's obviously very, very strong here. But yeah, it's being able to target like these specific Talaxu row cards more reliable than other people. With Piter, Stitched Horror is just absolutely absurd with Ariana. Basically, you can research station pretty much whenever you want. But even just general stuff as well, natural reflexes is very solid with her because you can be doing more research in the first place. You're getting the water, you're hitting more mining spots. Scientific Breakthrough is a very good choice for her as well. If you're playing Ariana, this is a point you should really be targeting. Realistically, if you're playing Ariana, you should be targeting, like, at the minimum, this point here with the Talaxu row. But you should probably be trying to find ways to get hold of both of them and kind of use that as your edge against the competition, because it's kind of hard for a lot of other leaders to get hold of both bumps unless the game goes long, or they draw intrigues or cards or let them get some bumps on the side, be it like Subject, be it like, grafting Carino genes, other bits and pieces as well, obviously some certain intrigues, or just getting tons of specimens. But again, that's generally because the game goes kind of long. So I think this is what Ariana's a crux of her game plan is targeting these high value and generally higher cost specimen cards, and basically just looking to go research station generally early. She obviously can also go pretty old school as well and just literally bomb the Fremen as well, of course, using her ring to get much more access to the Hardy Warriors, being a lot more combat focused, and just absolutely bombing this alliance is pretty effective, especially if there's other leaders in the game that are interested in that, like Beast or Baron, maybe a Tesia as well, maybe a Helena might also be interested in that as well. So if you could kind of like take that away from them and kind of dominate these spaces, that can really put a crimp in their day. But I think that's kind of where her large strengths are. I still don't think she's very good overall, and you have to be very picky with Ariana. She's not someone that I would just say use wherever you want. You've got to be pretty confident with her. You've got to have played her a bit to kind of get a feel for her. I think her spice added ability is still probably more of a hindrance overall. I think I would typically just rather get the spice than the card draw. If you knew what you were drawing into, then great. If you could combine that with maybe like a spaceport or like maybe like some kind of weird Talaxu robot. I don't really know. But I think like her spice is a little tricky. Her ring is amazing. Don't get me wrong. It is absolutely phenomenal. But I still think she's a very, very tricky and quirky leader to use. And I think that just kind of goes generally for Ariana's positioning around the table as well. I think ultimately she's just a pretty kind of exotic pick, really. One that I think if you're going for something specific, like if you got her in first position, and if you think you can go like research immediately to get hold of like one of these big cards, and Sayadine is also in the row, and you don't think anyone is either going to reveal early or trash the row ahead of you, then yeah, sure, you could do that. But there's a lot of ifs and buts there already. You've got to get access to that water. You've then got to get access to Research Station afterwards. And of course, if you only draw your ring, you don't draw any faction access, there's nothing you can do because there's only 2 cards in your deck that get you to city. So you need your ring or your faction access plus like recon in order to make that work. So very, very tricky to use. I think as well, it's like, I feel like the further back in the row she goes, I think it almost gets kind of even harder for her as well, because you then can't really control your own destiny. If I was going to play it, probably only in first spot. I think third spot's also fine as well. I think third spot, again, because you can kind of be very creative in kind of what you're doing. Again, in theory, thinking that these two are going to be going for the Fold Space Swordmaster dance. You might want to take advantage of that and use kind of third in order to kind of make some interesting weird moves. Maybe even as Ariana, Signet ringing up to Tech Negotiation to pull like an artillery. And then going Research Station after that could be an interesting way of playing it. I think that'd be a kind of an interesting way to look at. And then obviously using your card draw and kind of persisting in combats and being very kind of, just harassing a lot of combats, building up some swords, getting some cards like Shadow Mates, for example. I actually think it's pretty good for her. And that could be a really, really pesky. And obviously Fremen Camp as well is another great example of a card for her as well. But yeah, I think as Ariana, you're generally relying on getting that water, using experimentations in order to kind of, keep your economy going. If you kill your economy as Ariana, you're just kind of dead, and it's really hard to kind of get back on that train. So I can't really advise using her. I think she's always been kind of quirky, and I think very tricky to use, and I don't think her complications really are that worth compared to the value that she offers, compared to, say, some other leads which are also complicated, but offer a ton of value. So as for the tier listing, I think C is probably pretty fair for Ariana. When she high rolls, like, she can be pretty tricky, and she can, like, have a lot of flexibility. Again, water is a really valuable resource with Immortality, and going a game without any water hurts a lot because you're struggling to make use of experimentations a lot, which is kind of very, very important in the game, getting the research going. But I still don't think her generally, like, she's that advisable to use. If you fancy doing something a little bit different, go for it. And, like, I am far from an expert in Ariana by any stretch of imagination. I've very few plays of her lifetime. I think, honestly, over the course of my life playing Dune Imperium, I might have played her like 5-6 times. I'm not the person to go for it. But in just kind of observing other people playing Ariana, it's generally kind of mixed results. You get some games where you high roll and you do really well, but really any leader now can have those high roll situations, which talk a little bit more. So I think C rank is fine for Ariana. I can't really put her any higher. She can be okay, and she can do fine, but you're generally better off going for either a leader that's a lot more simple to use, or one where the complication gives far more benefits. So I think C is about the best I can give her. Next up, we have Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Still probably one of the most used leaders in the game, largely thanks to his Rise of Ix exploits. And still a very, very dangerous combatant on the field, and he always will be, just because his passive and ring abilities are both very, very good, almost regardless of the setting that you put him into. I do think Baron maybe has dropped a little slightly, and it's not necessarily me saying that I think he's weaker in Immortality. It's just I think that a lot of the weaker leaders from Rise of Ix have gained strength in Immortality. I'd say that kind of that leader band tightening. But Baron is always very, very dangerous, very fearful, and something you've got to be careful of. You can obviously look to race away with the game, though. His ability to do so, I think, has been kind of compromised a little bit. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Anyways. So, Baron Harkonnen, his Master Stroke ability, being able to get 2 free faction bumps with a 4 troop deployment or more, is always strong. Free faction bumps are amazing. There's a reason that there are literal intrigues that are just a faction bump of, and that is huge. And the fact that bribery, you've got to pay for it. So being able to get 2 for 4 troops is great because you're always generally going to be using those troops for a specific reason, targeting like an early combat, say, with maybe some with say a faction bump, obviously to look to kind of accelerate you early game, or later on in the game when you look, round 2, maybe round 3 even, when you're looking after some faction victory points even, with some map control, stuff like that. So you're never going to be sending those 4 troops in just for Master Stroke. It's what it also enables you on the side is the real strength of that. As for the faction choices, I think with Rise of Ix, it was basically you had to go with the Spacing Guild for shipping, and you pretty much always went Fremen because you didn't really pick the Baron in 4th positions usually. You picked him either in 3rd, 2nd, or 1st, and thus you could target the Fremen and take it away from people and just really absolutely bomb that track. And that's always been good for the Baron, and that hasn't changed particularly in Immortality. I think you pretty much are almost, as long as shipping and instead of shipping exists, I think you basically have to always take the spacing bump. Although I think his second ancillary bump you can have a little bit more freedom with. I don't think it has to be Fremen so much. We just kind of do Fremen because of what we're used to. And be honest, going Fremen is not a bad thing at all. If you go Hardy Warriors immediately, you're getting access to to the Siege here. Several actions and several turns, several rounds for some other players manage to get access to that, and that is really, really powerful. So even if there's some conflict here, and Carthage and Arakin gets taken, you can always go to Siege, and again, that water is really, really super valuable. I don't think Bene Gesserit is the best faction for him. I do think Emperor is okay, though. You might want to consider maybe looking to go Wealth once or twice. Obviously, looking to fund your Signet Ring. We'll talk about that in a moment. But also, I think there are some other leaders that are also interested in trying to go Wealth a lot early. We're kind of in this Swordmaster trying to get over it as quickly meta. And again, there are several leaders that make good use out of Wealth Mentat in like the opening round or 2 now. So maybe playing as Baron and kind of looking to cut that off from other players can be pretty pesky. Ecaz would hate that. Ilban hates that. Leto hates that. Paul hates that. So maybe cutting off of that is an alternative solution for you. If you're picking maybe Baron in 4th position and that's an alliance you think you can kind of target, maybe there's an option for you there. Well, next up, let's talk about his scheme ability, paying a Slaric for an intrigue card. This, since time immemorial, has always been incredibly strong, because if you have intrigues, you always have bonus options available to you, be it in combat, be it with tricky faction steals, with resource generation. It makes you always harder to play, and it always makes you a little bit scarier to go into combat against, because you might be holding anything, and it makes you really dangerous. And of course, at the back end of the game, you're going to hopefully pick up an end game or 2 victory point to get you over the line. Baron doing what Baron does. Now, the question is, has scheming gone up or down in value since the Immortality expansion? And it's a tough one to know. Here's a list of the 15 intrigues here that have been released with Immortality. I'm pretty sure it's 15 here. There are a few duplicates, admittedly, so we can like stack some of these together and not have to worry about that too much. But even if you, kind of put that aside and outside the case here, it's tricky. There are definitely a few more endgame points available to you, but I think some of them are pretty tricky for the Baron, in particular sort of Talaxu Puppet and Stunning Melange. In theory, look pretty good, but you have to have got all the way to the end of the research track with the Baron and have something else going on, and the Baron's not really suited for research unless you start picking up like some illicit dealings or stuff like that, or some harvest cells. Like, you definitely kind of get there, because if you're getting hold of these, you're getting hold of specimens, and like you're getting hold of these Talaxu bumps. What you can do on the Talaxu row is you can then take these skip sections more, and look just to get to the end as quickly as possible. You're not as reliant on those more decent rewards in the inner side of the track. But I don't think these are necessarily the best for him unless the game goes kind of long, which is kind of weird because the Baron never really wanted the game to go long. If you look at the other ones as well, economic positioning is kind of an alternate or war chest, which can definitely work for Baron. Of course, he's spending his salary a lot of the time. And Shadowy Bargain's not a great intrigue. I do think that extra specimen beat at the end game can be useful, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's that great. So I think Baron's value with scheming in particular, with the Rise of Ix, with the Immortality expansion, is pretty much the illicit dealings to give you more freedom to Laxu track. And that also kind of goes into groups and sacrifice and harvest cells. Which I don't think is too great, nor counterattack and that sort of thing. So I feel like his scheming is maybe slightly worse than Rise of Ix, but I still think it's still very, very powerful, and you're never going to go wrong. You know, just getting those cards, as I sort of say in games, like you could have the 3 worst intrigues in the game sitting in your hand, but no one else knows that's the 3 worst intrigues in their game, and it's going to make you tougher to play against in combat. People are going to be overcommitting resources. People are going to be a little bit wary of what you may or may not decide to do. So just having intrigues is never a bad thing at all. Now, there is one thing I want to make a special mention for the Baron, and something that he's had to kind of adapt to with Immortality and kind of how he approaches the game. So if you're playing the Rise of Ix, one of the things that you want to do as the Baron is end the game as soon as physically possible, because the Baron's strengths at the games comes at the very start of the game and sort of at the very end of the game. His mid-game is a little bit dicey, usually depending on how your scheming goes. And the idea is the scheming, to try and get like an end game victory point or two. But he merits the Baron's power is at the start of the game with his mastery ability and charging alliance to put him out of reach. Now, there is a lot more availability of faction spaces because people are more happy to go mining now, which means that there's less competition for the faction spaces. So people generally are kind of able to hit them more. And there's more ways to get hold of factions now as well. The Imperium Row helps a lot. Grafting helps a huge amount. And there's even some extra rewards you pick up from the Imperium Row to help you get with that as well. Now, what happened with the Baron, with Rise of Ix specifically, is what he wanted to do is basically get to 2 factions, get them to 4 persuasion each, typically like, say, the Spacing or maybe the Fremen or something like that, and just sit on it and just win the game as quickly as possible. Now, he can't really do that anymore, and you can't really ever now sit on alliances at 4 with 4 influence and just taking them on the threshold and expecting they're going to be safe, because they're not. There's so many ways now in order for people to take hold of alliances and steal them, and lots of tricky moves. And just, again, there's so many cards that, with grafting, especially grafting with, face dances, you're playing couplings, and there's so many cards now that allow you to kind of take what would normally be really strong agent boxes, but being able to send those to agents as well, very, very dangerous. What makes like Duke Leto very scary, like Boundless Ambition, for example, is a classic example of that. Which means that the Baron does find it a lot hard to win the game really quickly, because he can't just sit at 4 persuasion. He's then got to spend extra effort defending those, which is the last thing he wants to do. He wants to kind of get those advantages immediately and then just look to close the game up so other people can catch up. And it's very hard to do that now, especially because he's not the best researcher in the world either. That's something that's definitely been noted by a few players so far. So I feel like the Baron's had to adapt. He's still pretty good, still very strong, don't get me wrong. But how you use him in Immortality has had to be tweaked a little bit. As for the Baron's seat positioning, I don't think it's ever really changed. Baron is always going to be good in the first couple of spots, simply because of his ability to master stroke and look to get hold of shipping immediately. However, he sees that obviously second position Baron is still always good, and it always will be good because he can, on a lot of conflicts, basically guarantee that he's going to be able to ship immediately second round. There's nothing really anyone can do to stop him. I think third position, he's also been fine. He always has been pretty fine for Baron as well. Because again, if you don't have, you're threatening hardy warriors, you're threatening the combat. And that's the thing with Baron as well. Obviously, the further back in the row you are at the beginning of the game, you are obviously always threatening hardy warriors, and people might want to go there when they don't really want to for a conflict that maybe they don't particularly value or don't think they can hold. And you can still, with getting hold of like intrigues, you can still do lots of tricky stuff. And it also means you've got a better seat position for the tier 3s. Of course, remember, if you're sitting in third position as the Baron, as anyone, if you're in the third position on the first tier 3 conflict, you're first to act. So if you've got hold of 6 spice and you've got access to highliners, you can go there and no one can stop you. And that's a great for Baron to try and close out the game. I do think there is potential for obviously playing Baron in 4th position. It's not really the place to pick him. But I wouldn't be surprised to see people taking the Baron here if there were, especially in you used to see this occasionally with Rise of Ix. in like the GPIs, where people would take the Baron in full position. Not his best spot, admittedly. He is liable to get blocked. But simply so that the Baron didn't go further down the chain, where he was even more destructive if the leaders that are available were maybe slightly questionable and maybe not the best ones suited for the job. I still think Baron in any position is good. Like, Baron will always be dangerous, always be tricky. You're always up to a little bit of luck with your scheming. And there's something you got to be careful of the Baron in fourth, is making sure you get hold of that money. Of course, like, his smuggling is going to be gone then. And if third place decides they're going to go wealth, then you need to be hitting Hardy Warriors, and kind of vice versa. I think Baron is probably forced to go wealth or Hardy Warriors pretty much immediately, with a faction access card, assuming you draw one, of course, which you're not guaranteed to. And then leveraging some kind of advantage from that, either wealth to power your signet ring, or Hardy Warriors to get like a late marstroke going off, and then still looking to challenge shipping, or whatever you fancy from there. So, Baron, still very, very strong, although I do feel he has lost a little bit of edge since the Rise of Ix. So as far as the tiering, I think you probably have to give Baron still access to the top tiers. I don't think it's as clear-cut as it used to be. I don't think it's as definitive it used to be. But Baron almost always has some kind of tricky moves and is always going to be dangerous. And that's going to be the case. There's a reason he's still one of the most used leaders in the game, although I do think his win rate is perhaps not the most reflective of that. And that's just the way it goes. Like, I personally don't use the Baron a lot. It's actually pretty rare to see me play a Baron game. It's just not my general style. But I generally, he's never bad. Like, there's never a bad spot, a bad board, a bad seat position to say this is not a position to pick the Baron. Baron is always fine at the absolute worst, and he's going to be able to convert a lot of advantages, and just be a menace across the board. And scheming is always strong. So it's an S tier for Baron, but I don't think it's as definitive as clear an S tier as it used to be. I wouldn't want to put him in the A's. I think that's probably a little bit harsh and insulting. S tiers is probably got to be the way to go. Next up is going to be Duke Leto Atreides, who has always been a pretty solid pick amongst Dune Imperium. Very, very solid, very tricky with regards to factions and being able to chase them and just harass people, and sometimes just instilling the absolute fear of God into other players. Leto's journey, I think, through Dune Imperium has been an interesting one. In the base game, very, very strong, very, very popular choice. And I think with Rise of Ix, though, maybe slightly lost a touch of edge on occasion. Although he was still, that's not to say he was a bad lead by any stretch of imagination, don't get me wrong. But I do definitely think his immortality, he's probably one of the stronger leaders going now in amongst the game. For a variety of reasons. So we'll get into those. First up, Lancer popularity, getting hold of council spaces, cheaper. This has just gotten better, interestingly, with immortality. Which is interesting, I guess, because, of course, there's not been any changes to the board at all with immortality. It's still the exact same. The High Council's still the same. The texts are changed. Nothing's changed here, but it's simply because of the card composition. There are a lot of decent cards that let you get hold of, council access. With grafting as well, so you can use that combined and get some action compression in there. Has always been really good. Again, general just card drawing has gone up in value. Storing your actions out and making sure you're in position, I think, is more important now in Immortality as well. In Rise of Ix, sometimes it was better to kind of get into a space first, whereas Immortality, there's a lot more options now. There's more ways to like infiltrate spaces as well and stuff like that, and there's a lot more trickiness going on here. So stalling out actions and kind of putting pressure on people kind of indirectly onto comments and like that is gone up in value, in my opinion. Prudent Diplomacy is still probably the best ring in the game. It's pretty close with like Ariana's, but being able to spend a spice to chase a faction is just so good, and it's kind of absurd. Leto as well, of course, can combine that with Boundless Ambition or getting access to interstellar shipping to basically get double bumps out of nowhere and just steal alliances. You get Duke Leto and you give him shifting allegiances. I mean, good luck with that, really. Very, very strong. And obviously, you are going to be having probably more spice in hand now as well. You're using your experimentations to fund your signet ring. You tended to find previously, Rise of Ix, you would send your signet ring to like your imperial base, your basins and stuff to get hold of your spice, whereas now using your experimentations to do it, and then sending your signet ring probably to a city to deploy troops and chase, or to maybe get hold of like tech negotiation, or probably just going shipping with your signet ring. Very, very, very scary. Definitely, I do think Leto's biggest strength in this game is factions and just being an absolute terror across them, and just threatening people. I think one of Leto's greatest strengths in this game, which is not something that's used a lot, but I think is something that should be explored more, is just charging a faction. Picking a faction that's going to be competed, maybe the spacing, Fremen, and everything like that, and just going all in on the faction. Because you can do that because you can use prudent diplomacy to pick up the persuasion elsewhere on the side. And it basically means if you commit enough effort to a faction, no one can realistically challenge you for it, because they realize what's going on, and it's so, they know if they want to get hold of that faction, they are absolutely going to have to max it out, and people don't like, obviously, you be careful, once you get hold of the alliance at the 4th spot here, you don't know further bonuses for going 5 and 6, that is extra effort you've got to commit, and if you're going for a faction, people have to do that, and you put people in really uncomfortable positions with having to defend alliances with moves they don't want to do, and it just really eats away at them, and it's really, really nasty. I still will talk about it every now and again. The Immortal Leto game that I played against Lannister. Shame I never recorded it. I wasn't recording at the time. But I played against him and a couple of really decent players and just absolutely smashed the table in 6 rounds. Just slaughtered everyone. It's one of the best games of Imperium I've ever played in my entire life. And the trick was, I basically just, he was playing as Romba, and kind of the other couple leaders were kind of like, sort of needed a bit, there was an Ecaz there, I think, and someone else. And basically, what I did with Leto is I just bombed conflict immediately. I think the first 2 conflicts were for victory points, or the first 2 were free, like first and third ones. Cashed both those in, and then basically just turtled up. Charged an alliance to get hold of one, which I'd already done with going with the Fremen, using my ring to pick up points elsewhere, picked up a spices flow somewhere, and just won the game in 6 rounds, and I was basically unstoppable. And that's the thing, when Leto rolls well, he is absolutely destructive, and really, really hard to contain, because it's the usual case with the diplomacy. It's not necessarily him doing it to steal alliances. It's the threat of him doing it to steal alliances. That is the really tricky part. And that's why leaders like Tezzyverse is another good example. Why they're so dangerous, because it's the threat of what they can do, forcing you to make preemptive choices that you might not want to do. And just the absolute fear of God. You know, Duke Leto, the fact that he can get a double bump from internal shipping with his ring, that's terrifying. That's really hard, and that's not including if he's got any intrigues or anything else to help with that. Like, no alliance is safe with Duke Leto unless you max it out. And if Leto's on the board, you almost have to max an alliance out, or at least get up to space 5, like, really quickly, so that you can kind of ward him off, and that you've got a bit of warning. But you have to basically pick a faction, bomb it, and just hope it kind of works out, which is so, so tricky. And I also think as well, Leto really benefits a lot from various positions in the game. Spaces 2, especially for Leto. I mean, just being able to smuggle Swordmaster and threaten that. If Leto gets his Swordmaster first in the game, here is a massive edge for him. Being able to take more actions, picking up the spice as well with those extra things, kind of advancing Talatsu track, and then using his ring to catch up and cause people further harassment is so, so dangerous, and it's by far his best spot. Really, really scary. Third as well, for a similar reason, so that if first or second decide they're going to go off the beaten track, then you can capitalize on that. And of course, Leto doesn't have to even go Swordmaster, because of his ability to get hold of influence. He's always going to be a menace for shipping and can always get there wherever you put him. Even in 4th position, you can always, if first decides to go fold space, well, you just use your signet ring and you go there. And then if second place ends up going to fold space, and third, you're almost always going to get to fold space first and get shipping first. So wherever you go, real harassment. Leto's probably his worst spot is first. His ability to... both his abilities aren't really that suited to being in first position. You're never going to be able to smuggle realistically in first spot to get hold of your Swordmaster. And obviously, if you need to chase factions with the prudent diplomacy, if you're first to act, you can't chase anything. So that's a little bit tricky there. But you will sometimes see moves where a leader will maybe go first action, maybe to go smuggling. To cut that off, and then use his signet ring to pick up assuming that second place goes fold space, Leo then fold Thorvald's used the signet ring to get that bump as well, and then looks to basically cut off Green, like, basically round 3, realistically, unless they think they can get hold of an extra point elsewhere. Maybe Memo Quarters on the row. I have seen that occasionally with Duke Leto. And a tricky move you've got to be careful of is Duke Leto going Haga Basin and then Tech Negotiation for Memo Quarters. Because he can double bump spacing. One with his ring and one for Memo Quarters and get access to shipping first spot. It's a tricky move. Keep an eye out for that. Very rare. But, you know, if people let you do that and, like, if there's no beast on the row either, people don't really want to be going to Tech Negotiation to stop you getting Memo Quarters realistically, unless their hand is that bad, they've got no real choice anyways. Like, if they've got their signet rings, especially if they've got their faction accesses and their experimentations, they want to be using those. They don't really want to block that, so, you know, maybe give it a spin. Maybe it's a fun move you can come up with. So, as for tier listing, I think it's a little interesting for Leto, actually. I've extolled a lot of his virtues, but he does have some potential weaknesses. He is obviously relying on getting access to resources, and if he gets cut out from Solari or Spice, or you just don't manage your economy very effectively, Leto loses a huge amount of his edge. Also, that as well, again, like, if you don't get Swordmaster really quickly, or if you start getting cut out of Mentat as well, I mean, you need that extra economy to make more hits to the council, make use of your popularity, to get hold of those extra spice hits, so you can use your ring, stuff like that. It's actually always very, very important for him. So it's real SA, I think, for Leto. I think I'm going to put him at, like, the absolute top of A tier. I think he's very, very good. And I think he's probably benefited somewhat in Immortality. But I don't think he's the best pick going. I do think he has a couple of tricky spots from time to time. And I think what happens as well with Leto is people are wary of the danger he possesses and are kind of more opt to try to defend against him. You know, having Leto in theory to steal alliances is great. But everyone knows that he can steal alliances, so people will play more defensive with them in the first place. You might not get as much value out of prudent diplomacy as you might expect. So you got to be a little bit careful of that. It's very tempting to put him to S tier, and it's very close. But I don't think I can quite put him there with a couple of the people that are going to be on that top shelf. So very solid A rank for Leto, which is nothing to be upset about.